When we were planning and preparing for the teaching series that we've been on, you'll know that we've been looking at something that we've themed called Encountering God, Deepening our Discipleship through Biblical Encounters. And we wanted to land this morning on the person of Mary, Mary, the mother of Jesus. And today is Advent Sunday, the first Sunday in Advent, 1st of December. I don't know if that fills you with joy or dread, I don't know, probably a mixture. But this week I came across a sort of spoken word that modernizes something of the story of Mary. So I want us to watch it.
And now the angel is nowhere to be seen, and she wakes from a dream with her head down the loo and next down something for the acid, the youngest at antenatal classes, feeling like a stretched smart lump trying to hide a bump in oversized clothes, waddling down the street with swollen feet, scared witless, wondering whether she's got what it takes to be a mother. Now she knocks on the door of another knocked up, someone else who feels each kick and every elbow flick and wakes up sick, a cousin with stretched hips who's both blessed and broken. And immediately, almost as if obediently, Elizabeth feels heaven and earth kicked and flipped inside her as her heavy belly moans with sympathy. An angelic symphony bursts from her amniotic sac. And Mary answers back, "My soul magnifies the magnificent. It glorifies the glorious, to the God who kicks the wall of the uterus, who is worshipped from the womb, to the God of bedsit rooms, of tower blocks, of basketball and hoop shots, of parked up 4x4s and shut up shops, to the God of tear-stained cheeks and grazed knees, of caffeinated drinks and quarter-pounders with cheese. Praise be to the Father of cold and rainy nights, of overcrowded buses, of flickering street lights, in the name of bright white Nikes and leggings, hoodies, caps and knackered-looking jeggings, in the name of not living but surviving, in the name of ducking and diving, in the name of poverty. God comes to me, wrapped in hand-me-down clothes, dirty nappies and blankets, as the creator of the universe, the maker of all planets, is pushed in a buggy and laid in a basket. For he is with us, not against us, one of us, not opposed to us. And he has not forgotten the honest or the humble, the straight-talking, the mustn't grumble. His eye is on the single mum with no disposable income, drowning in debt and depression. The OAP try to make ends meet from a pension. Those falling through the cracks, they're the ones who've got his attention. Yes, in a world that don't make sense, he's the gold and frankincense, overturning tables, turning the world upside down, right side up, bringing heaven to earth with a seasonal burst of Christmas. And in case you missed this, he makes Christmas every day. No, not in the shops, or on the telly, or the jingle jangle of songs and sleighs and snow. No, in the stomachs of the hungry, in the arms of the lonely, in the hearts of the broken. Christ can be found knocking on doors, kicking on walls of a mother's womb, asking us to make room for the kingdom to be born in us and through us. Glory be to the infinite, magnify the magnificent, oh my soul bless the incarnate, glorify the omnipotent, praise be to the God who became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood.
To share that, because I think one of the dangers is that we're so familiar with the story. We're so familiar with this story that we're going to come into over the next 4 weeks. And it all begins, in one sense, with this moment, this young, maybe 16, 17-year-old Mary, living in a sort of forgotten northern town, village really, of Israel. That village was the village of Nazareth. And she's just going about her normal business. She's sort of very insignificant. And yet God comes to this Mary with this amazing announcement, this amazing story. If you want to follow it, it's in Luke 1, 26 to 38. I'm not going to go through it in detail and read it through, but I'd encourage you to read the passage, to take some time to just allow the significance. And I guess what I wanted to think about today is this encounter that Mary has with the angel Gabriel. It's a moment that transforms her life, but as we look at it, I hope it's going to encourage you to deepen your own discipleship journey. I think Mary's encounter challenges us and hopefully will inspire us to trust God more fully. In a world that is uncertain, in a world that is so shaken, how do we keep our focus on a God who invites us in to this journey? Mary is asked to step into something so big that it feels impossible. I don't know whether have ever felt that you've been invited into something that feels impossible to embrace. So let's just work our way through the passage. Like I say, it's interesting when you think about Mary. I love that modern adaptation of the spoken word, because Mary was just a regular teenage girl living in this northern village up in Nazareth. She's not really anybody of any status. She's very likely just to be overlooked. Her life was pretty well mapped out for her at this stage, because she'd already been betrothed to Joseph, so the parents have already sorted out what's going to happen with her life. She's on a trajectory. She's going to get married, and into that marriage then there would most likely be children, and that would be her life. Joseph had a business, as we know, and as you'll know if you've been around us for a while, he wasn't a carpenter. He was a stonemason. He would make things out of stone. He'd be working on houses and tombs and roads. He'd be quite a good particular job in that sense. But Mary, there was no sort of trajectory for her in that society, in that world. Easily overlooked. And yet when the angel turns up, he says to her these words in verse 28. He says, "Favoured one, the Lord is with you." Isn't that so powerful? When God turns up and speaks to her through this angel, he speaks about how God sees her. It's a highlight of God's grace. It doesn't focus in on Mary's status in that sense. He recognises the grace of God on this individual. Now, we were reflecting a couple of weeks ago, weren't we, on this truth that God often chooses the humble and the ordinary to accomplish extraordinary things. God uses the humble and the ordinary. That's me and you. We are the humble and the ordinary. We are the ones that God invites in to this amazing story. Gabriel comes with this message, doesn't he? He says to her in verse 31-33, "Mary, you will bear the Messiah, Jesus, who will reign forever." And not surprisingly, Mary's initial reaction is like, how can this be? It's like, how is this going to happen? And this is a really interesting moment theologically. Because up to this point, God has been promising a plan of redemption for humanity. Some of us have been reading through the Old Testament. We've been looking at the Old Testament in the Bible studies that we're doing on the first Wednesday of every month. And we're gathering again this Wednesday. If you could join us in the afternoon or the evening, it's the first Wednesday. And we've been looking, and as we look through the story of the Old Testament is always pointing us towards this plan of redemption, this plan that God has to redeem humanity. But the only way that God can do this is by inviting us as humanity into his plan. And this is the moment that this begins to be fulfilled in a radical way, that God invites Mary into the plan. For whatever plan that God had, he needed a Mary. For if God was going to come as a man and be born as a son and live out his life for those 33 years as a human, he needed to be born. I don't know whether you can get your head around that truth. Like this God of infinity, of eternity, who was and is and will always be, chose in this moment to embrace this young 16-year-old virgin girl and said, through you, I'm inviting you to be a part of this redemptive story. This announcement is like a fulfillment, isn't it? If you know your Old Testament scriptures, you'll know that there was a promise in Isaiah 7, verse 14, that says this: the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. There's been that promise that's been held for hundreds of years by the Israel people. They've been looking forward to this moment. And yet, it needed Mary to say yes. It needed Mary to say yes. Mary needed to become the vessel through which God's promises to Abraham and to David and to Samuel and to all those great Old Testament kings and prophets. It needed this 16-year-old girl to say yes. I love how God does that again and again. He doesn't choose the things that we would think he would choose. He chooses the weak, the humble, the hidden, the ordinary, to come into this story that he's working out. And he encourages us in this invitation. And it's not just an invitation to Mary, but there's an invitation here for all of creation to witness the breaking in of God's kingdom. This is a significant moment. And it underscores the grace of God, because Mary's not chosen because of her status or her deeds, but in one sense she's chosen because God chooses her. Why Mary? Why not, a number of other young teenage girls at that time? Why Mary? Something in the heart of God, something in God's heart says something in Mary's heart, and he chose her. But it reminds you that actually God's redemptive work is not so much dependent on that human merit. It's on his initiative, his love. He chooses Mary, he chooses you, he chooses me to be invited in to this story. And Mary says yes. She says yes. Mary's faith and obedience align her with God's divine purposes. And in some ways she models for all of us how we can then all be responsive to God's invitation. It's by saying yes. It's by saying yes, I will step in to this invitation. In our discipleship and the journeys that we're on, sometimes we don't realize that our story is caught up in this bigger story. But there's a bigger story of redemption and God's purposes being worked out day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out, decade in, decade out. And in God's unfolding purposes, you and I are called into that moment. And the responses that we make to what God is calling us to do opens up then whole new opportunities for God's purposes to be fulfilled. It's that paradox where it's hard to get our head around, because God says his ways are not our ways and his thoughts are not our thoughts, because God's sovereign and his will's worked out, but he only does it by people like you and I saying yes. I don't know if Mary had said no, would God have found somebody else? It's a bit of a hypothetical question, is it, because she did say yes. But maybe this morning, I want to encourage you to think about the context of your discipleship. The way that you are seeking to say yes to God as he calls you deeper, as he calls you on in that journey. And maybe even at this Advent time, to use this season of Advent to think and reflect, to take some moments to again just recognize that your story is caught up in his story. And your yes opens up doors for God's purposes to be fulfilled. The way that you respond to God opens up so much opportunity for God's kingdom to come. At this moment, Mary did not really have any understanding, did she, of what was going to then unfold in her life. But what she did begin to realise, that by saying yes in that moment, she was going to go into a bit of an unknown future. Her life, like I was saying before, was pretty mapped out for her. But now it's totally turned upon its head, isn't it? We can read that, as we read the story, we see, don't we, then, how Joseph has to come to terms with what's happening. How the family reacts to this fact that supernaturally God has impregnated Mary with the divine Son of God. Well, they just didn't know it was God. She's just pregnant. The shame, the rejection, I think it's so powerful that Mary goes and spends 6 months with Elizabeth. Elizabeth's her cousin, but she's much older, as you know the story. And Elizabeth takes Mary in, and I think that's a moment where together they must have just, what were they talking about? These two women who were both pregnant, but at both ends of their lives, both being used by God for the coming of the Messiah. Elizabeth, the mother of John, who becomes John the Baptist. Mary, the mother of Jesus. I know I've said this a few times, and I know many of you do this, but if you do watch The Chosen, season 4 starts, it's not a spoiler, is it? Because we know the story. Hopefully you know the story. But it starts with Jesus hearing the news that John's had his head cut off, he's been beheaded. And it just encapsulates again for me that Jesus and John were cousins. I don't know if you've had your own cousins. As children, cousins are really important, I think, if you have that privilege of being in an environment where you live by each other. And I had a whole load of cousins on the Glover side of my family, and we used to all gather on a Sunday afternoon at my grandparents, my dad's parents, the Glovers, and we used to all gather, and there'd be 9 of us, 9 cousins, with our nan and granddad. Well, normally with my nan, because my granddad was at the Working Men's Club, and we would also hang about in the children's. If you've ever been to a Working Men's Club, you'd have a children's corner where you have a bag of crisps and a can of Coke. And you'd be left there while everybody was in the main hall playing bingo. My nan was a master at bingo. So my nan, Nana Glover, she used to play bingo with 9 sheets. Honestly, it was great. And maths was amazing. And all these cousins would hang out, and I don't know what Jesus' life was like as a cousin with John. But this, again, this Mary and this Elizabeth, it maybe gives an insight as to why God chose Mary. Just as I'm talking, I'm thinking, look at that connection between Mary and the delight. It's all to do with the genealogy, isn't it? Actually, if you get into the genealogies of Matthew 1, you'll see perhaps why it was Mary. But in this moment, God is wanting us to recognize that in our ordinariness of life, this ordinary girl with no real awareness of what is now going to transpire for us, begins to say yes to God. She keeps saying yes to God. She keeps responding to God. She doesn't rely upon her own strength. She relies upon the power of God. The verse, isn't there, a little bit later on, when Jesus is a child, it talks about that Mary stores all these things up in her heart. She just, all of the events that unfold over the next, for us, over the next 6 weeks or so, all these stories that we're so familiar with, were like happening for the first time to Mary, weren't they? All these moments. The 9 months of pregnancy, the trip from Nazareth down to Bethlehem, the shepherds, all these things that happen to her, all because she keeps saying yes to God. She stores up what God is doing. And I want to keep encouraging, maybe, I don't know if you do this, I don't do it as much as I should, but Sue does it for us a lot. Is that she'll write down, she'll journal things that God has been doing in our lives. So we can store it up. So we can go back to it. And if you talk to Sue, she's got journals that go back like almost all 36 years of our married life. Promises from God when we got married. Promises from God that haven't been fulfilled. Things that have been really good, things that have been really difficult. But I encourage you, even at this, the end of this year, just take some time, look back on 2024. Is there things that you can draw out where you sense God's speaking to you? You felt His presence, He's been with you in the bad times and the good times. He's reassured you in the uncertainty of life. It's good to store up, isn't it? The things that God has done. Things that God has said to you, those moments when you've read the scriptures and He's spoken to you. Mary was chosen and favoured by God. And in some ways she's a sort of illustration to us that we too are recipients of God's grace and favour. How do you live out your life with that understanding that you are a favoured one of God? That when God turns up in front of you, His words to you are highly favoured, loved, affirmed, I am with you, I'm for you. Like the creative light was talking about, that God sees us, He knows us, He loves us, that we're seen by God. I think one of the things that I would encourage myself and encourage us all to do is to deepen the sense of gratitude that we live with. To keep being grateful. To keep recognizing that God is with us, God is for us. We're favoured not because of what we've done, but because of what Christ has done for us. Gratitude shifts our focus from our circumstances to God's goodness. It lifts us, as we've been encouraging ourselves over these last few months, haven't we? That it's good just to lift our heads. It's good to lift up from the stuff that's going on around us. And, you know, even this week, you know, I think Friday it's called Black Friday, isn't it? I think it was a pretty dark day for our nation on Friday. Any decision to agree to assisted suicide, I just think it needs a lot more working out for our government, whatever political spectrum you stand on. It is complex, don't get me wrong. I think a lot of people are motivated out of compassion, actually. But there's something fundamental in the way that we live our lives as society, that we are so afraid of facing death. And how we look after the marginalised and the vulnerable is at the heart, isn't it, of our Christian message. But we need to keep lifting our heads and not get too drawn down, because you know, it's just one thing after a load of other things, isn't it, in our world right now. This gratitude in what God, this perspective, and even joy that can come. You know, this season is a season where joy is there for us. It's the joy, you know, hopefully one of the most joyful times, but I also appreciate it. It's also one of the most hardest times. You know, we could talk about that in other places, but you know, if we're going to be those who are favoured ones, let's be individuals like Mary who seek to walk in obedience to God's calling. Mary's response in verse 38 is, she says this: I am the Lord's servant. There was a willingness to obey God's call, even when it was costly and uncertain. And I want to encourage us at this Advent season to keep going back to this moment where we're able to say yes. How do you keep aligning your life into the purposes of God? How do you keep going back to God and saying, actually, in this season of uncertainty, I want to say yes. I want to say yes to God's invitations into relationships, into workplaces, into communities. I want to partner with God in His redemptive work. And at times that obedience can mean sacrifice. Saying yes to something usually means saying no to something else. So where are we able to say yes? So I want to encourage you, how do we share God's favour with others? How do we live our lives as people who don't just receive God's grace, but we also share God's grace? Just as Mary bore Christ to the world, we are called to carry His love and His hope to those around us. Lucy started off the morning, didn't she, by reading to us from Matthew about the light of the world. And that's what you and I are. We are the light of this world. We reflect the glory of God through His work in us by His Spirit. So live out this week, live out in this season as God's favoured people. Wake up in the morning, have a good look in the mirror, and remind yourself that you are favoured. Because there's so many voices in your head, or in my head, that will actually say to us that we're not favoured, that we're not good enough, that we're not enough, actually. And if we just did this and just did that and just did the other. But actually God says to us that you are favoured. His favour is on you, it's on us. Live with that sense of God with you. That's the key message, isn't it, of this season, that God is Emmanuel, God with us. So let this season of Advent be a time of encountering God afresh. Take some time. Join me in reading a Bible plan. I'll put it out on the Friday email. If you're on YouVersion, you can find me and we can do it together. Did day one this morning. I don't know if you've done it already. But do something this month that you connect with God on a regular basis. Some people read the book of Luke. 21 chapters, 21 days, lands on Christmas Day. You could do that. You could get the official community together and read it. Okay? Start today. Read 21, 24 days. Whatever, just find things that will help you this season to encounter God and encourage ourselves to keep saying yes, to walk forward in faith. There's an amazing statement from the angel Gabriel, which I'll end with, in this whole discourse, interaction between Mary and the angel, where the angel Gabriel says to her, nothing is impossible for God. Nothing is impossible for God. And again, we just need to remind ourselves that God is the God of the impossible. And just to stir up our hearts with hope, to trust and to look for those moments where it seems impossible. So I've just picked up these just by the door again, just this season of encouraging you to invite people. Remember, a couple of weeks back, we printed out quite a lot of these, hard copies. There's also lots of digital versions that you could use in WhatsApp groups or on our socials as a church. But just invite people. That could be something, again, to invite somebody in. Invite somebody into the story to hear for themselves for the first time. Come to something that we are doing. Take them to something that you're going to. So let's just pray together. Just if the worship team could come back up at this point. We'll just pray together for a moment. So Heavenly Father, we thank you for Mary's encounter with you and her example of faith and surrender. And as we enter this Advent season, help us to reflect on your plans for our lives, to trust your goodness even when we face uncertainty. Teach us to say yes to you as Mary did, to walk forward in faith knowing that nothing is impossible with you. Empower us to live as your favoured one, carrying the light of Christ into our homes, our communities, and into our world. And Lord, this morning we surrender our hearts, our plans, and our lives to you again. May we encounter you afresh. And may we all continue to deepen our discipleship journey, especially in this season of waiting and hope. In Jesus' name we pray.